Welcome back. Before we get to the painting portion of this video, a bit of an introduction to what the purpose of this video is and how I want to move forward with the Patreon, starting with this. You know that my Patreon has never been a platform where you will see one miniature painted from start to finish in a linear fashion, and that is due to the approach that I have with miniature painting in general, as well as with every other aspect of this hobby. And it mirrors the fact that I need to and want to alternate between painting, sculpting, and of course making the videos. Now, I know that this is different from other Patreon channels, but I'm not really worried that it might put people off. On the contrary, I think this is what makes the channel unique in a way, and I want to keep it like that. Especially since this Patreon will always be about trying to keep the hobby of miniature painting, in whatever form you practice it, interesting, and this is the approach that I personally find motivating and enjoyable. And what that means is that I always have more than one project that I'm working on at the same time, and in this case let's focus on miniature painting because this is what the videos are actually about. Now, since I have multiple painting projects going on, I will always have a few ongoing series, video series over the span of one or multiple months. For example, I have this Golden Demon entry that burned me out a bit, or on which I got burned out a bit, simply because I painted so much before the Golden Demon. And it's still not finished, but it's a good example to show you how we'll proceed from here. The next few videos will be about how I painted single elements of this entry, for example the skin, the axe, the hammer of this marine, the texture and contrast of the clothing, the non-metallic steel. We haven't really covered that in depth yet. How to do the checker pattern on this, and what it also means for competitions and stuff like that. And not to forget how I did the base without an airbrush, and what you can do with pigments and how you can use those. Meanwhile, I also want to do a video like this where I cover a technique that is different from my usual painting. It doesn't have to be a technique, it can be any other aspect of the hobby. But in this case it was time pressure due to Golden Demon competition, and how you can use that to push your painting a bit and move it into a different direction, and just find new aspects of painting that you probably wouldn't have gone into with your regular painting approach. As of filming this video, I have at least 2 more aspects that I want to cover in videos like this. For example, how non-metallic metal has evolved during the last few years, and other aspects of painting competitions. As I'm editing the videos, I will of course film other footage, and next up I will cover, for example, the base building and painting of these ladies. And of course I will give you the rest of the videos of my other Golden Demon entry, the Griff Charger, where I haven't covered everything yet. At the end of videos like this one, like the Golden Demon Diaries, I will give you a summary about what I personally learned about the aspect that the video is dealing with, and how thinking about these aspects can make your hobby time feel more worthwhile and fun. For now, let's get to painting. Okay, that brown maybe, some of that red. I wanted to do the X, and I want to aim for, or to try mixing it on the miniature like a palette, or use the miniature as a palette. Just want to try it out because there's a an area here that's basically made for that. So this is going to be my highlight color. Stone gray. Just need something like a blue, maybe anthracite gray. There wasn't a lot of black in that left. Just watering down those a bit more. Let's see how this works. Okay, so after the first layer was put down to cover the base coat, second layer was applied of the anthracite gray. And on top of that, I took the dark shadow brown and just worked in the colors into the still wet second layer of the anthracite gray. And as you saw, I added 2 layers in some areas. Where I added 1 layer, I wanted the whole thing to blend together. So I wanted the brown to blend into the blue, the anthracite gray, and create a gradient. And the second layer was obviously to reinforce the color. Now adding some stone gray, and in between you will see me pick up some of the lighter anthracite gray, and I'm actually going over the areas where the first layer, the mix of brown and blue meets the gray, and I'm going over with the blue, with the anthracite gray again, to smooth out those gradients. So this technique is actually not like loaded brush, for example. It mixes both wet blending and what the Spanish are calling copy bases. So you're adding those copy bases that are saturated parts of color, and they mix into the still wet lower layers below that, and you get something like a gradient, and you can work on that gradient the same way you work over the whole thing with glazes, with the copy bases approach. But it's all still wet, and you still have to move quickly, and it's a less controlled technique than I usually use, but it works pretty good. So to sum it up, you put down a solid layer of the base color, let it somewhat dry to cover the base coat, then you put on a second layer that you're going to work with, and you blend in the shadow color, in this case the brown, and make sure that there is a gradient. Then you do the same with gray, so make sure that those 2 layers don't meet, make sure that there is a mid-tone, in our case the anthracite gray, and also blend in the stone gray, and then you can go over the transitions with the mid color again, in our case anthracite gray, and work on those transitions while everything is still wet, and the result is going to be a good smooth blending. Now on top of that, of course, we are also showing the edges some love, and I'm taking the mid color, the stone gray, before I go on and add some white later. Doing some detailing and doing all the edges that are also not directly facing up. And using a very fine brush tip, I also go over the edge that separates the two planes from each other. And I'm paying more attention to the middle part, fading it somewhat out towards the outer areas, and creating something like a light spot where the lightest area of that plane is. I felt that the reflection wasn't as intense as I wanted it, so I just carefully put down a bit more of an intense layer on top of that. Yeah, I really like that axe. How much work was that, or how much time was that? Like 2 minutes. And just to do the last touch-ups, I'm adding a mix of stone gray and white for the last highlights, and you're going to see that I'm just touching a few edges and a few areas that I want even lighter, so just to increase the contrast and show some reflecting light in there. Let's see, some dark lining. Yeah, I really like the way that the stone gray interacts with the blue. And like I said earlier, I don't like to go up to white on a lot of things, apart from non-metallic, but just starting or doing the wet blending with the more neutral gray and not white also helps a lot with not being flaky in the end or chalky. And you can still put like a very light line of whites that I just did here, and it's going to improve drastically. One thing else I need to do is cover this down here. Yeah, that space is probably a bit too confined. Also, it's just dried out. Yeah, I can definitely see that working a lot better once it's when it's not as hot and dry. So this was definitely an experiment and something I would have probably not done for a competition miniature. However, it turned out pretty good and I liked it. And it's something that I now can add to my repertoire and that I definitely will be more inclined to using in the future, and not worry too much about, you know, planning everything too much and, you know, trying to lay out every single aspect of the miniature, and maybe add a bit of a random element that might be pushing the whole thing into a new direction. And generally I learned a lot about not getting too stuck in what you want to do with the miniature. And I find this is a really worthwhile aspect and a really worthwhile experience about miniature painting. Now, of course, I've been doing wet blending before, but I never really treated the miniature like a canvas where you mix colors on the actual miniature. And as I said, this was a bit of an experiment. And what do I personally consider a successful experiment? I'm sorry. Of course, I have to like the end result, but when doing these experiments, keep in mind to always be open about any result. Don't be too stubborn in how you want the experiment to look afterwards. That is very counterproductive. Now, that doesn't mean you should not experiment to achieve a certain look that you have in your head, but that's a way different video than this one.